The first fracture in my life opened with the scrape of a letter opener and the dry breath of old paper. The conference room smelled like dust and lemon disinfectant. Outside, Macio's April heat pressed on the windows while Dr. Oliveira said my mother's full name. He tapped the will and began. My sister, Lara, sat to my left, counting her rings with a nervous thumb. I stared at the ficus by the window as the room turned into paper and rules. I thought I understood grief by then. 4 a.m. Spirals, a drawer that still smelled like lavender, the habit of setting 2 cups before remembering I live alone. The lawyer read the polite choreography of legal words, be it known hereby devise, until the sentence that split the table. The inheritance, he said, eyes moving but voice steady, shall be divided among all my children, including the one you do not know. Lara stopped breathing for a beat and looked at me as if I were the one holding a secret. My aunt's mouth flattened into a careful line. A chair scraped. A man stood. He didn't perform it. He just stood the way people do when a bus finally arrives. Blue shirt, sleeves rolled, a cap in his hands. Older than me by a decade, sun in the creases at his eyes. My name is Raphael, he said. I'm her son. He sounded tired and certain. Nonsense, my aunt said, sharp. Sit down, Lara added, even though she was also half rising, as if outrage had to be performed with the body. Dr. Oliveira lifted a hand and made quiet with it. He asked for documents. Raphael offered a plastic folder, worn from use. Inside, a birth certificate from Pinedo, 1977. A photo of a woman before blue shutters. A letter in my mother's square hand dated 14-2023. A lab report I didn't want to read but understood. DNA 99.98%. I put both hands on the table. In 2011, when her blood pressure first scared us, I began sending money. $200 for pills, later $210 for the imported ones she believed in, $382 once when the power bill came red-stamped because a neighbor had tapped our line. In 2015, I took a job in São Paulo answering phones for $2,800 per month, 8 pastels standing up, and wired home what I could. $300 here, $600 there, $200 when the roof leaked, and a man named Gil promised to fix it, and didn't. In 2020, when Lara ran to Rio with a drummer and came back wrecked, I bought her a bus ticket and found a room. None of this made me noble. It made me tired. I thought the ledger of my years meant something solid. I thought it gave me the right to know the whole story. If this is true, I said to Raphael because the words had to touch someone, why now? Why appear only when she is gone? He did not flinch. Because she asked me to wait, he replied. She called in December. After, they will listen better. My aunt laughed. Dry. Raphael held the letter. My mother's handwriting was the pragmatic roundness that labeled freezer containers Feijon 1207 and clipped grocery lists. She had written, Raphael, forgive the distance I kept like a locked door. What I did was survival, not pride. The floor tilted in a way that had nothing to do with gravity. I wanted to be angry at him, at her, at the grammar of secrets. But the anger kept snagging on old images I had ignored. A blue shoebox with a ribbon on the highest shelf. The way she refused to walk down a certain street in Pinedo the summer we went to see the churches, saying the sun was too cruel that day. 19-minute balcony calls, she said, were from a cousin. Harmless alone, together they looked like a face. It might have been Raphael's. Dr. Oliveira explained the mechanics. The will recognized him. The law would count. Nothing today. Dates were offered. More papers waited to be stamped into meaning. Lara leaned into me, barely there. Do you believe him? She whispered, voice barely steam. I watched Raphael's broad, work-defined hands, a faint scar across the left knuckle. He had the posture of someone who has stood in lines most of his life, not a thief of stories. Just a fact, like heat or rent. Outside, vendors shouted caldo de cana. A bus shrieked to a stop. The sea breathed 2 avenues away. Raphael approached carefully. There are photographs, he said. A letter I kept. If you want to see. I nodded. Not today, I managed. I need time. He accepted that like a full sentence. We exchanged numbers. My aunt hissed I should block him. Lara said nothing, which was worse. At home, the apartment felt like a museum of her small efficiencies. The rubber band jar, the folded nightgown, the shopping list clipped by a Diosebam magnet. I put the photocopy of the will on the table and made coffee I didn't drink. I stood on a chair and reached for the blue shoebox I had never opened. The ribbon resisted like an old habit, and then gave. Inside were photographs. Too many to be an accident. My mother at 20 with a scarf. My mother holding a baby in half shadow. A tall boy with a bicycle on a clay road I did not recognize. In the bottom corner, a receipt from a clinic on Rua do Comercio, dated $02, May 1977. I touched the ink as if it might still be wet. My phone buzzed once. It was Lara. "Are you okay?" I typed, "No, but I'm standing." I stared at the photographs until late afternoon softened the room. I waited for anger to burn the confusion clean. Instead rose a tired tenderness for the things my mother never said, and the price of them, plus the first cold coin of a question I could not keep from forming. If he is my brother, what else have I been reading upside down all these years? The room answered with silence that felt metallic. Somewhere a kettle clicked off in an empty kitchen that still smelled like her soap. I stood still and listened to my own name, as if it were being said for the first time. The night after the will reading, I could not sleep. I left the light on in the kitchen, sat at the small wooden table with the shoebox open like a wound. The photographs inside felt alive, as if they had been waiting decades for breath. One in particular unsettled me more than the others. My mother on a clay road, a bicycle leaning on a fence, and in her arms a boy no older than 3, with dark hair plastered from sweat. The background was Pinedo. I recognized the old church tower. The date scribbled on the back, January 1980. That was 5 years before I was born. I held it so long the edges grew soft from the dampness of my hands. Grief had already bent me into strange shapes, but now suspicion began to crawl over everything I thought I knew. I remembered 1998, when I asked my mother why she never let us visit certain relatives. She had looked out the window and said, "Some stories don't belong to children." At the time, I thought it was about debts, feuds, those endless grudges that travel with families in the Northeast, like baggage on a donkey's back. But now the sentence replayed with a new accent. Maybe it was Raphael's story all along. I dialed Lara. She answered on the second ring, whispering from her bedroom as if conspiracies could hear through walls. "I can't believe this," she said. "Do you think it's fake?" I told her about the shoebox. She swore she had never seen it. I asked her if our mother ever slipped, ever hinted. Lara said no. Then after a pause admitted once in 2009 she overheard a call. Our mother's voice sharp and pleading, saying, "I cannot tell them. They wouldn't survive it." Lara assumed it was about a loan shark. Now it was about flesh and blood. The next morning I met Raphael at a cafe near the port. It was humid, the sea air sticking to my skin. He arrived with a folder tucked under his arm, and a look that was half defensive, half weary. He ordered black coffee and no sugar. I watched him stir it anyway, stirring a bitterness he couldn't change. He handed me a letter, the ink fading at the folds. My mother's handwriting again, dated 2017. It said, "I wanted to bring you into the circle, but every time I tried, fear was heavier than courage. I told myself later, 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 and later became too late." I asked him where he grew up. He said Pinedo until 17, then construction jobs in Recife, then São Paulo in the 2000s. He laughed once when he said, "I must have walked past you. Maybe on Avenida Paulista. Maybe you held the door in a bank lobby." Imagine that. The absurdity struck me. 2 strangers tied by blood, brushing shoulders without knowing. My stomach twisted. When the bill came, he reached for it. I stopped him. "She raised me with sacrifice. I can pay this one." He looked at me long, as if weighing whether to correct me. He didn't. Back at my apartment, I stared at the framed picture of our mother holding me at baptism. Her smile seemed unchanged, but now I wondered if it was already a mask, already covering a second child kept elsewhere. Years of sacrifice rearranged themselves in my mind. The nights I stayed awake sending her money so she wouldn't lose the apartment was part of that burden because she had another son she helped quietly. How much of my struggle was tangled with his survival? The thought was a knife sharpened on both edges. I phoned Lara again. "We need to see the lawyer together," I said. "If this is true, everything changes." She muttered something about manipulation, about men showing up to steal what wasn't theirs. But even she sounded unsure, softer than before. That night, as rain battered the window, I dreamed I was walking down Rua do Comercio, the oldest street in Maceió, and every door opened onto another secret. At the end of the street, my mother stood holding two hands, mine on one side, Raphael's on the other. She looked at me and said, "The true inheritance is not money, it is survival." I woke up choking on the weight of that sentence. When dawn broke, I knew I had to return to Pinedo, not just to see records or houses, but to touch the ground where the truth first grew. Because if Raphael was truly my brother, then my entire map of belonging had to be redrawn. I arrived in Pinedo on a humid Saturday afternoon, the kind where the air clings to your skin and the streets feel like they carry whispers of everything they've seen. The bus from Maceió rattled for 3 hours, its windows streaked with dust, the kind that makes every memory feel older by the time you arrive. I hadn't walked those streets since 2004, when my mother took me to see the churches and insisted we leave before sundown. At the time, I thought it was her knees, her tiredness. Now, stepping off the bus and inhaling the smell of river water mixed with fried pastel, I wondered if it was fear that drove her away. Raphael was waiting by the old cinema, now closed and covered in posters for evangelical events. He looked uneasy, his cap pulled low, but when he saw me, he raised his hand with the same slow certainty he had in the lawyer's office. "Come," he said simply. His voice was softer here, as if the town itself asked for quieter tones. We walked past the market stalls where vendors shouted prices for mangoes and cassava, and every face seemed to turn a second glance at me. I realized then that everyone in small towns knows the rumors, and we were walking inside one. He led me to a small, pale blue house near the river, its door swollen from humidity. Inside, a woman in her 70s sat peeling oranges. Her hair was silver, her dress faded. "This is Dona Celina," Raphael said. "She raised me when our mother couldn't." My chest tightened. The woman looked at me and, without surprise, said, "So you are the other one." She spoke like someone finally setting down a load she had carried too far. Celina told me pieces and fragments, like torn pages put back together. My mother at 19, desperate, alone, with a baby and no marriage to anchor her. A family scandal, a decision to hide the boy with a trusted woman, promises that one day it would be revealed. Then years rolled into decades, silence hardened into routine, and Raphael grew up believing he was half orphan until he found a letter when he was 15, tucked under a mattress. A letter signed in my mother's round hand, promising love and apology. I wanted to hate her in that moment, but all I felt was the heaviness of choices I could not imagine making. I thought of 1985 when she was pregnant with me. Did she already carry the weight of a son she had to keep hidden? Did she look at my face and see his? Celina said, "She visited every year, brought clothes, money. Not much, but enough. She always said, 'Someday I will put it right.' She just never found the courage." Raphael handed me a worn photograph from a drawer. It was our mother, young, standing between him and a girl I didn't recognize. He whispered, "That was Anna. She didn't survive childhood. Fever took her." Ah! The photograph blurred in my hand as if grief had no end. My mother had carried not only the silence of a hidden son, but the grave of a daughter none of us ever knew. The betrayal was sharper now, but so was the compassion. She had lived with ghosts I couldn't even name. We walked later by the riverbank. Children played barefoot, splashing in the brown water. Raphael pointed to a tree and said, "She once told me she kissed me goodbye under that tree. I was too young to remember. But sometimes when I pass it, I feel something." I looked at him and saw the lines of a man built on work, but also the shadow of a boy left waiting. That night in the guest room of a cousin's house, I lay awake, listening to the fan buzz overhead, and thought about inheritance. Money was just numbers on paper. The true inheritance was silence, the kind that shapes who we think we are. And now I was holding pieces of a life rearranged, forced to see that my mother was both more fragile and more complicated than I had ever allowed her to be. When I returned to Macchio 2 days later, Lara was waiting at my apartment. She sat cross-legged on the couch, smoking nervously, even though she'd quit years ago. "So it's true," she said before I opened my mouth. "He is real." I nodded. "More real than us, in some ways." She exhaled smoke and muttered, "Then what do we do now?" Her question hung in the air like another will, unsigned and unread. The days after returning from Penedo felt like walking inside a storm with no sound. I went to work at the office in São Paulo, answered calls about shipping delays and misplaced invoices. But my mind was elsewhere. The headset weighed on me like a chain, every bom dia hollow against the echo of what I had learned. When my shift ended, I would sit on the metro staring at strangers and wonder how many of them were carrying secrets that would one day overturn someone's life. At night, Lara called me constantly, her voice split between rage and fear. "We can't let him take everything," she said. "Do you understand? The apartment, the little land in Maurici, the savings? We earned that with her. We were here." I tried to remind her that money wasn't all, but the truth was, I also felt the sting. I remembered the nights I skipped dinner so I could send 300 Ries home, the weekends I worked overtime for another 400. Every coin had felt like a stone on my back. To learn that some of it may have been for a brother I didn't know, that was a betrayal money couldn't measure. Still, I couldn't ignore what I had seen. The shoebox in my mother's closet, the letters, the photograph of Anna, the fever-stricken sister erased before I ever existed. Our mother hadn't been malicious. She had been desperate. She had balanced survival like a juggler with too many knives. But Lara refused to hear this. "He's lying," she said over and over, even when the DNA spoke louder than her words. 2 weeks later, the second meeting with Dr. Oliveira was scheduled. This time, the air in the office felt charged. Raphael arrived in a clean shirt, his hair combed back, documents in hand. Lara wore black, as if it were a funeral. I sat between them, my hands restless against the polished table. The lawyer explained the clauses. The estate was modest. The apartment in Maceo valued at $280,000, a piece of land near Maurici worth about $65,000, savings of $42,000 in the bank, and a few pieces of jewelry that had more sentiment than gold. Divided equally, each of us would receive a share. Lara slammed her palm on the table. Equal? After everything? He wasn't here. He wasn't by her side. We carried her when she was sick. We buried her. Raphael didn't react with anger. He looked at Lara, then at me, and said, "I carried her too, just in another way. You don't know what it was like to wait for her visits, to pretend another woman was my mother, to wonder why I wasn't enough for her to stay. That was my inheritance long before this table." His words hit me harder than I wanted to admit. The lawyer sighed, accustomed to families tearing at each other like vultures over scraps. He reminded us that the law didn't ask about feelings, only facts. The facts were clear. Unless contested in court, Raphael's share was secured. Lara left the office in a storm of slammed doors. I stayed behind, silent, staring at the papers that divided a life into numbers and signatures. Later that evening, Raphael asked me to walk with him. We strolled down Avenida da Paz, the city lights flickering on as dusk painted the sky. He told me about his children, 2 boys aged 12 and 9, living with their mother in Recife. He said he worked construction, sometimes traveling to São Paulo for projects, sometimes barely making enough to pay rent. "I don't want to take more than what is right," he said. "I only want what she wanted me to have. And maybe," he paused, searching for words, "maybe a brother who doesn't hate me." The street noise softened around us. For the first time, I saw not a rival, but a mirror cracked differently. A man molded by absence while I was molded by sacrifice. Both wounds deep, both invisible to outsiders. I nodded slowly. I don't hate you, I said. I hate the silence that built this wall between us. When I returned home, I found Lara waiting again. She was furious that I had spoken to him, that I seemed open to understanding. He will ruin us, she shouted. Don't you see? He'll take what we fought for. I wanted to tell her that what was being ruined wasn't the inheritance. It was us. But the words stuck in my throat. That night, as I lay awake, I realized the test was no longer about money or property. It was about whether we could survive the truth our mother had hidden. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized survival was the only inheritance we had all been given. The weeks after that meeting were a blur of arguments and restless nights. Lara stopped speaking to me for days at a time, slamming her phone down whenever I suggested even a drop of empathy. She moved through our mother's apartment like a guard dog, cataloging every dish, every old bill, as if guarding the walls themselves could erase Raphael's existence. I tried to keep peace, but inside me there was a war. Because every night, after Lara's fury had burned out, I found myself remembering Raphael's face when he spoke about waiting for visits that came once a year, about pretending another woman was his mother. That loneliness was not something you could invent for sympathy. It was too raw, too lived. One evening I went back to the blue shoebox. I pulled out a folded paper tucked deep in the corner, one I had overlooked. It was a receipt from a clinic in Recife dated 1982, written in my mother's hand. Consulta. Raphael. My breath froze. So it hadn't only been in Pinedo. She had followed him, quietly, paying bills in secret while raising us in Maceió. The sacrifices I thought were ours alone had been stretched wider. Maybe the months when the lights were cut off, when Lara cried because we couldn't buy new school shoes. Maybe those holes existed because she had been patching a different life in silence. The revelation burned me. I walked the city at night, down Avenida Moreira Lima, past the closed bakeries, hearing the sea in the distance. I wanted to scream at her ghost. Why did you make me carry this weight without the truth? Why did you let me believe I was the only pillar when in fact there was another foundation built elsewhere? But ghosts don't answer. They leave you with the echo of your own questions. 2 days later, Raphael called me. His voice was steady, but I heard hesitation. I need to tell you something, he said. We met at a park near the coast, the air thick with salt and frying oil from a food cart. He showed me another letter, one she had given him the last time they met in December. It was short, only 4 lines, but it sliced deeper than anything I had seen. Forgive me. I lied too many times. The truth is, you have more than one brother. Life took her from me, but you still have them. When I am gone, find them. I read it 3 times. My mouth went dry. More than one brother. Them. Not just Raphael. There were others. The world tilted beneath me. All those years, all those sighs she buried at the kitchen sink, all the nights she sat in silence after dinner, were they weighted not by tiredness, but by the crushing effort of keeping a labyrinth of lives apart? When I returned home, Lara was waiting. She had gone through the drawers again and found a hidden envelope taped beneath a shelf. Inside were bus tickets, faded photographs, and another name I had never heard, Marcos. A date, 1984. A photo of a boy with curly hair standing by a church door in Recife. Lara's hands shook as she shoved it at me. Do you see? She betrayed us again and again. She paced the room like an animal trapped. But I wasn't angry in that moment. I was empty, hollowed by the realization that we had lived our entire lives in a house of mirrors. Everything we thought was sacrifice had been part of a story with missing chapters. That night, I sat on the balcony staring at the city lights, hearing my mother's voice in the wind. Someday I will put it right. She never did. Now it was on us, on me, on Lara, on Raphael, to decide whether we would drown in her silence or climb out of it together. The discovery of Marcos turned the fragile balance into chaos. Lara spiraled further, her anger becoming the only language she knew. She accused me of betrayal for even meeting with Raphael, and now she claimed I was inventing things just to weaken her fight for the inheritance. The envelope with Marcos's name lay on the table like a bomb no one wanted to touch. but it changed everything. If Raphael was real and Marcos too, then the family we thought we knew was just a fragment of what truly existed. I couldn't stop thinking about the dates. Raphael born in 1977, Marcos in 1984, me in 1985. My mother had been carrying secrets across decades, building lives in shadows. And I, the dutiful son sending money back from São Paulo, had been a pawn in her game of silence. That thought made me sick and tender at the same time, because how desperate must she have been, how cornered, to choose lies over truth for nearly half a century. I traveled to Recife with Raphael 1 week later. He insisted on coming because he remembered faint rumors. A neighbor once saying there was another boy. The city was loud, buses grinding through traffic, the air heavy with exhaust. We went to the church from the photograph Lara had found, its facade cracked but still standing. I asked the priest, an old man with shaky hands, if he remembered a boy named Marcos in the 80s. He narrowed his eyes, thought long, and then nodded. Yes, a boy left with relatives. I baptized him in 1984. His mother was nervous, eyes red from crying. I never saw her again. Hearing that pierced me. I pictured my mother standing there, her face younger, holding another baby she couldn't claim, whispering lies to survive. The priest didn't know where Marcos went after. No one did. It was as if the earth had swallowed him. Back in the hotel, Raphael sat on the bed, staring at his calloused hands. If he exists, he said quietly, he deserves to know, even if it destroys us more. I agreed, though part of me wanted to bury it. We already had enough wounds. Did we need another? But silence had already poisoned us once. Repeating it would be worse. When I returned to Maceió, Lara refused to listen. She tore the photograph of Marcos in half and shouted, "You will ruin everything! She left the apartment for us, not for ghosts!" I looked at her and for the first time saw how fear had hardened her. She wasn't protecting our mother's memory anymore. She was protecting the story she needed to survive. That night, I dreamed again. I saw my mother at the kitchen table, her hands shaking as she wrote a letter. Behind her stood 3 shadows of children. When I called her name, she turned and said, "I gave pieces of myself away. Now you must decide whether to bring them back together." I woke with tears on my pillow and the certainty that the inheritance of silence had to end. Even if it meant tearing the past wide open, even if it meant losing what little certainty we had. Because only by finding Marcos, or at least his truth, could we begin to rebuild something that resembled family. The search for Marcos consumed me. Days turned into weeks, and my life in São Paulo felt like it was being lived by someone else. I went to work, answered calls, smiled politely at colleagues, but in my chest there was a hole opening wider each day. At night, I scrolled through old archives, genealogy forums, parish records scanned into blurry PDFs, chasing shadows of a boy who should now be a man nearing 40. Every time I saw the year 1984 in faded ink, my pulse quickened, only to drop again when the trail led nowhere. Raphael called often, sometimes just to check if I had news, sometimes to remind me I wasn't alone in this search. He confessed one evening, his voice tired from work. "I dream about him. In my dreams, he looks like me, but younger, and I'm trying to tell him everything before he disappears. Then I wake up, and he's gone again." His words cut deep because I too had started to dream of a brother I had never met. In mine, Marcos was always walking ahead on a crowded street, never turning when I called his name. Lara, meanwhile, grew colder. She avoided family dinners, ignored my messages, and when we crossed paths in Maceió, she refused to look at Raphael. One night, she came to my apartment and shouted until neighbors knocked on the wall. "You don't understand," she cried, her face twisted with rage and grief. "If you keep digging, we will lose everything. She left us with scraps already, and now you want to split them further with strangers? I won't let you destroy what's left." Her words echoed long after she slammed the door, and I realized then that my sister was not just afraid of losing money. She was terrified of losing her identity. Because if Raphael and Marcos were part of us, Then who was she? Who was I? One afternoon, I received a call from an unknown number in Recife. The man on the other end spoke cautiously, as if testing the ground before stepping. "You've been asking about a boy named Marcos, yes? I think I knew him, but he doesn't go by that name anymore." My throat tightened. He explained that in the late 90s, Marcos had left the city with an uncle, gone north, and started using a different surname. No one had seen him since 2001. Some say he went abroad, others say he got lost in the streets. "I can't tell you more," the man said before hanging up. The uncertainty gnawed at me. If Marcos was alive, he could be anywhere. If he was dead, then he was another ghost haunting my mother's silence. I told Raphael what I had learned, and he nodded grimly. "Then we keep looking. We owe him that much." His determination both comforted and exhausted me, because I knew the search might never end, and the longer it went on, the more it fractured what little family we had left. One night, while staring at the shoebox again, I found another folded scrap tucked behind the lining. It was barely legible, smudged by time, but it carried a sentence that froze my breath. "If they ever find each other, tell them the truth was always love, even if I failed to show it." I read it again and again until the words blurred with my tears. For the first time, I understood that this was no longer about inheritance or money. It was about stitching together the pieces of a mother's broken courage, about turning silence into truth before it was too late for all of us. The 8th chapter of this unraveling began with silence, but it was the kind that pressed on your chest until breathing felt like treason. After the call from Recife, I stopped sleeping properly. I would lie in bed with the shoebox at my side, the letters spread out like tarot cards predicting a future I couldn't control. Each word from my mother became a riddle, every faded receipt a breadcrumb leading deeper into her labyrinth of secrecy. And in that darkness, one question burned. If Marcos was out there, why had she never brought him back? I began retracing steps not only in documents but in memory. I recalled nights in 1992 when I was a child, waking to find her whispering into the phone, her back rigid, her voice sharp with sorrow. At the time, I thought it was a fight with relatives about money, but now those half-caught words sounded different. "He must not know yet. Promise me." Had that been about Marcos? Had my entire childhood been lived in the shadow of another boy's absence? Raphael and I grew closer during this search. He called every evening after his shifts on the construction site. His voice tired, sometimes hoarse with dust, but steady. He told me stories about his childhood with Dona Celina, about wearing the same sandals until the soles broke, about waiting every December for a small envelope from our mother with 50 reais tucked inside, and a note that always ended with, "I think of you." Hearing that gutted me. Because while I was busy resenting her stinginess, angry that she wouldn't buy me a new backpack or a decent pair of sneakers, she was quietly splitting her already meager coins between two lives. I hated her for it. I loved her for it. The contradiction became a weight I carried in my lungs. Lara, on the other hand, unraveled further. One night she barged into my apartment drunk, eyes swollen, mascara streaked, and shouted that I was betraying her by siding with Raphael. She accused me of selling our inheritance to strangers, of digging up corpses that should stay buried. When I tried to calm her, she slapped the shoebox off the table, scattering the letters across the floor. "These are lies," she screamed. "She would never do this to us." But I saw the flicker in her eyes when she caught sight of our mother's unmistakable handwriting. The truth had already taken root inside her, and no denial could rip it out. In early July, I decided to return to Recife alone. The city felt heavier than before, its humidity like a second skin. I spent days haunting civil registry offices, flipping through books that smelled of mold and dust, looking for a trace of Marcos. In one record from 1999, I found an application for an identity card under a different surname, but with a date of birth that matched perfectly, 12th of April 1984. The photograph was blurred, but the eyes, they were ours. Wide set, dark, carrying the same stubborn weight I saw in the mirror every morning. The clerk at the registry shrugged when I asked if the man was still in Recife. "People come, people go," he said. "Maybe São Paulo, maybe abroad. That uncertainty stung more than any rejection. Marcos was alive, at least then, and that single fact changed the air around me. He was not just a ghost, he was flesh. He was somewhere, and he might even still be carrying a fragment of our mother's silence. When I returned to Maceo, Lara refused to hear it. She barricaded herself in our mother's apartment and changed the locks, as if shutting out Raphael and me would erase him from existence. She called me a traitor, Raphael a fraud, and vowed to contest the will in court. Raphael, hearing this, only sighed. "She's drowning in fear," he said. "Let her fight shadows. We'll keep walking forward." That night, sitting on my balcony with the letters spread once again before me, I felt the truth settle in. The inheritance wasn't property or jewelry or even money. The inheritance was survival, stitched from lies and half-truths, from silence and scraps of courage. Our mother had tried to protect us and failed, but she had loved us all in her fractured way. The question now was whether we would let that love divide us or bind us. I closed my eyes, hearing her voice as if it rose from the river winds of Pinedo. Someday I will put it right. But she hadn't. Now it was my turn to decide if I could. The ninth turn in this story began not with papers or lawyers, but with an unexpected knock at my door. It was a Tuesday night, rain streaking down the windows, when the sound startled me out of a restless half-sleep. I opened the door and found Raphael standing there, soaked, his face taut with something between exhaustion and urgency. In his hand, he held a folded newspaper, dated that very week. "You need to see this," he said, his voice low. I let him in, and he spread the paper across my kitchen table. It was a small article buried in the local section about a man found in Recife after years missing contact with family. The name printed was different, but the date of birth and a detail about originally from Pinedo caught Raphael's eye. The article was about a man hospitalized after an accident on a construction site. My blood ran cold. The photograph was grainy, but there was no mistaking the curve of the jaw, the stubborn line of the mouth. It was him. It was Marcos. The world tilted as if the ground had slipped beneath me. For months I had been chasing him like a ghost, and now here he was in black and white, alive but broken. Raphael looked at me with trembling hands. "We need to go." The next morning we boarded a bus to Recife under skies heavy with clouds. The city greeted us with its usual roar of traffic, but to me everything seemed muted, as if the world knew I was about to touch a part of myself I had been denied my entire life. At the hospital, the smell of disinfectant hit me hard. The receptionist checked the registry and pointed us to the third floor. My heart pounded with each step. In a dim ward lit by flickering fluorescent tubes, we found him. Marcos lay on a bed by the window, his head bandaged, one arm in a sling. He looked older than I imagined, worn by years of labor and absence. But when his eyes opened and he looked at us, I felt something collapse inside me. It was recognition, instant and undeniable, as though blood speaks a language words cannot. Raphael whispered first, "It's us, your brothers." For a moment Marcos stared blankly, confusion clouding his gaze. Then tears welled and slid down his temples. His voice cracked, raw from disuse. "She told me, one day you would come." I sank into the chair beside his bed, my chest tight. "We didn't know," I said, my throat burning. "She never told us. We only found letters, photographs. We thought you were gone." Marcos closed his eyes, and a trembling laugh escaped his lips. "I was gone. To everyone. Even myself." He explained in broken fragments how he had left Recife in the late 90s, how he drifted between jobs, how shame followed him like a second skin. Our mother had visited him once, secretly, in 2001. She pressed money into his hands, kissed his forehead, and promised that someday he would meet us. Then silence swallowed everything. The three of us sat together in that sterile hospital room, bound by blood, grief, and the ruins of our mother's choices. It was not joy that filled me, but something more complex. Relief, sorrow, anger, and an aching tenderness. Raphael gripped Marcos's uninjured hand. I touched the edge of the bed, grounding myself in the reality of it. For the first time, all the pieces of her fractured life were in the same room. That night, I returned to my hotel, unable to sleep. I stared at the ceiling, haunted by a single truth. Our mother had hidden him not out of cruelty, but out of fear. Yet in protecting us from each other, she had stolen from us decades we would never reclaim. And now the inheritance was clear. It was not land, or money, or property. It was the burden of deciding what to do with the fragments she had left behind. The next day, Lara called me. Her voice was sharp as ever, demanding updates, demanding proof, demanding control. I told her only this: he's alive. His name is Marcos. And whether you accept it or not, he is our brother. She hung up without a word. For me, there was no turning back. The silence was over. The 10th movement of this story did not come as fireworks or courtroom victory, but as something smaller and, in the end, heavier. A key in a plain brown envelope and a sentence written in my mother's square, practical hand. 2 weeks after we found Marcos in the ward that smelled like bleach and boiled sheets, after the bandages had been changed and he could sit up to sip coffee that tasted like copper, Dr. Oliveira called and asked us to come by on a Friday afternoon. The sky over Maceió had that metallic sheen storms wear before they choose a street to fall on. Lara arrived late, jaw tight, eyes refusing to meet mine. Raphael came in a clean shirt again, calluses brighter than the fluorescent lights. Marcos insisted on coming even though the elevator ride left him pale. We sat around the same varnished table where the first crack had opened, and the lawyer laid down an envelope with my mother's name and the date, 10th of January 2024. He said there had been a codicil, a short one, to be opened only if all her living children were present. He tapped the envelope like a metronome. I felt my heart sink to it. Inside was a safety deposit key clipped to a note. The note did not try to be poetic. It did not apologize in grand phrases. It said, in my mother's steady letters, that there was a small box at a bank on Rua Barão de Atalaya, and inside there would be clarity for once. She had underlined that last phrase twice. We walked to the bank as if carrying a candle through wind. The manager led us to a room that smelled like steel and old paper. When the lid lifted, I braced for money. There was none. Instead, there was a blue school notebook, a folded letter, a photograph, and a receipt book that looked like it belonged to a seamstress. I opened the notebook first. On the first page, she had written the title as if it were a recipe: What Everything Cost. Month by month from 1977 to 2023, she had listed amounts she had sent, bus tickets she had bought, medicine purchased in cash, uniforms paid in installments, shoes on layaway, a doctor in Recife in 1982 who took money and kept his scowl, a construction foreman in 2001 who agreed to advance a week's pay to a young man with nowhere to sleep. The handwriting shifted over the decades, bigger when she was angry, smaller when she was afraid. In the margins, she had written our names next to certain lines. Raphael beside a winter blanket in 1988. Marcos beside school notebooks in 1991. Lara beside braces paid slowly between 2002 and 2004. My name beside a bus pass in 1999 and the first rent I could not make in 2015. The sums were not neat. The ledger did not prove fairness. It proved attention. It proved a mind that never stopped counting because there was never enough to stop. The letter came next. She began with the simplest line she had. I was never brave at the right time. Then she told the part we had turned into rumor. In 1976, she fell in love with a man who already belonged to someone else. A man who would come to Penedo when his work brought him near and leave with promises like scraps of ribbon. When Raphael was born in March 1977, she was 19. And the street knew everything before noon. Shame wore her like a coat. Dona Celina took the baby, because the house would have been a burial of shouting otherwise. In 1984, there was Marcos, the same man, the same pattern, and a feverish winter she never forgave herself for. In 1985, there was me, from a love that finally tried to be proper, and failed loudly in a different way. A man who left for Aracaju and never called again. She wrote that she had carried us all like mismatched china in a cardboard box, praying the corners would not give out. She wrote that she did not tell us because every time she looked at one child, the others became ghosts, and she could not bear to multiply grief by confession. I wanted to hate her again, but love came like a bruise pressed accidentally, sudden and tender. The photograph was of the three of us without us knowing it. She stood in a doorway in 2001 with a hand on a boy's shoulder who had Raphael's eyes but Marcos's mouth, and on the table behind her was a birthday cake with my name frosted in shaky blue letters, proof she had stopped to buy it between two lives. I reached for the table edge because the room tilted. Lara made a sound I had never heard from her. Not anger, but something lower, the sound a rope makes when it frays. At the bottom of the box was the receipt book. It was from a funeral association in Pinedo. Tucked inside was a separate sheet dated 3 February 2024. It was a donation slip. She had given instructions that if her children could not agree, if any of us filed suit to exclude another, the apartment would be sold and the proceeds donated to Santa Casa de Misericordia in the name of Anna. I read the line twice, then a third time. It was the first time our sister's name appeared in a legal place, the first time her short life had been given weight in a ledger. The twist landed not like punishment, but like a hand on the shoulder forcing us to look where we had refused. If we clung to money, we would lose not only it, but the right to pretend we honored the dead. If we chose each other, we kept a roof and a chance. Lara went still. All her arguments seemed to gather in her throat and then collapse. She would do that, she whispered, half fury, half awe. She would dare me to be generous with one hand and slap me with the other. Raphael's mouth softened. Marcos, who had been quiet, asked to see the letter. He read it slow. When he finished, he folded it the way men fold maps they plan to use. He looked at Lara and said, not unkindly, "We can end this here, not lose everything, or we can fight and cut our mother in half again." The room held its breath. Even the bank's air conditioner hummed softer. We walked out into the heat and crossed to a cafe that served coffee burnt enough to taste like a decision. We ran numbers on a napkin, because that is how families do math when the calculator feels too official. Apartment valued at $280,000, land at $65,000, savings at $42,000. Splitting like adults meant each of us would take enough to patch roofs and pay debts, but not enough to buy the past back. Lara traced circles on the napkin with her thumbnail. She said slowly, as if the words had to be paid for, that she would not contest. She said she would help sell the land in Marisi if the apartment remained for me and her to live in until Marcos found his footing and Raphael could move his boys for school if they wished. It was imperfect and made of string, but it was ours. We shook hands like strangers who had become something else. In August, when the wind shifts in Maceo and the sea becomes a different color for a week, we went together to Santa Casa with a bouquet and the receipt in my pocket. The nun at the desk asked for whose memory the donation was made. I said, Anna, and the name felt like a door unlocking. We lit a candle that smelled like beeswax and old churches. Lara cried openly for the first time since the first reading. Raphael stood with his hands in his pockets, the way men in northeastern towns stand at wakes, present but not theatrical. Marcos, still thin from the accident, whispered a prayer I could not hear and then smiled at me with our mother's exact mouth. For once, I did not need to decode anything. In September, we sat again at Dr. Oliveira's table. But this time there were coffees, not declarations, and we signed papers without slamming them. When the last signature dried, the lawyer cleared his throat and said he had one more thing. He slid across a small envelope addressed to my grandchildren. Inside were 5 notes of 20 reais and a warning in her handwriting that almost made me laugh through the ache. If you spend it on fireworks, at least invite your uncles. The room softened around that joke. Grief let in a little light. I took the bus alone to Pinedo one Saturday to stand under the tree Raphael had pointed out by the river. The town smelled like frying oil and wet earth after a short rain. I pressed my palm to the bark and imagined her there at 19, pressed thin by shame and hunger, and a future that would not stop shouting. I did not absolve her. I did not condemn her. I did the only thing the living can do for the dead. I promised to carry what she could not carry to term, which is to say the truth. When I returned, Marcos had started physical therapy. His laugh came easier. Raphael sent voice notes where I could hear his boys fighting over a football, the ordinary wars that mean a house is alive. Lara began to say Raphael's name without the bitterness catching on it. She still counted spoons. She still jiggled the locks. But one evening I found her at the kitchen table with the blue notebook open, tracing the list that had our names side by side, and saying in a voice I had not heard since we were children, "Look how she tried." On the last night of September, I stood on my balcony with the shoebox empty at last, its contents now in frames on the wall or files in a drawer that anyone in the family could open. The city below wore its usual necklace of lights. Somewhere, a kettle clicked off as if it were still 2011. I thought about the word inheritance and how I had chased it across deeds and bank slips only to find it hiding in the quiet. It turned out to be the ability to stay in a room with the people who share your blood and say the hardest sentences without breaking the table in half. It turned out to be survival. Yes, but not the thin kind that grits its teeth and waits. A thicker survival that risks tenderness, that counts not only what everything cost but what it was worth. If you asked me now what the twist was, I would say it was not the discovery of a brother or even two. The twist was that the math of love refuses to be balanced on paper. My mother failed in all the ordinary ways people fail when they are young and cornered, and then she spent decades trying to pay interest on those failures with small, relentless acts. She never found the courage to say the whole thing out loud. We did. The true inheritance, then, is that our children will not need a key to a bank box to know who they are. They will hear it in our voices at the table, in the names we say without flinching, in the way we choose to stay when the storm presses its weight against the glass and the kettle begins to sing.